You are not what others have done to you. You are what you replay inside yourself every day without realizing it. There are no comforting theories here, no easy slogans. What's coming next will hit you, maybe even make you angry. That's exactly the point. This isn't about memories in your head. It's about those your body still stores, in your reactions, in the patterns you've come to believe are simply part of your personality. All the times you've said, "I've already processed it," and yet you keep ending up in the same place. This is not a feel-good journey. It's a confrontation with yourself. Chapter 1. The body doesn't forget what the mind wants to bury. For a long time, I believed that everything that weighed on me emotionally took place only in my head. I was convinced that distracting myself or convincing myself something no longer hurt was enough. I told myself that story so often I eventually believed it, as if merely not thinking about something could also make my body forget. But it doesn't. The body has its own memory, one that works quietly, without asking, without waiting for your permission, and without caring whether you're ready to face your pain. You don't have to remember every detail, relive every scene, to still react today just as you did back then. Often, a smell, a certain tone of voice, a subtle sensation that seems insignificant is enough. And suddenly your body reacts as if on cue. Your palms sweat, your heart pounds faster, your stomach knots, or sudden fatigue overwhelms you for no apparent reason. And then you search for explanations. You think it's stress, lack of sleep, or simply a bad mood. But if you looked closely, you'd see it's something much older, something that's accumulated in you over the years. The body stores everything you don't want to see. That's how it works. And it's a protective mechanism we learn as children. If there were times when crying was a problem, showing fear meant weakness, or asking for help ended in rejection or punishment, your body did what it had to. It adapted. It tucked away emotions, tensions, and sensations deep inside so you could carry on. It did so efficiently, but not without a cost. Over time, what you haven't processed turns into blockages, into physical symptoms even doctors often can't explain. Muscle tension without a clear cause, recurring digestive issues, migraines that appear out of nowhere. It's as if your body is saying, "I can't carry this alone any longer. If you won't let it go, I will express it in my own way." It took me years to realize that the extreme exhaustion that sometimes overwhelmed me had nothing to do with my work or schedule. It was an emotional burden I'd carried since stages of my life I could barely recall. Moments when I had to be strong because I believed I had no choice. Moments I never truly processed. And my body, which never forgets, kept sending signals, first quietly, then louder and louder, until they manifested as symptoms. You don't have to have experienced major trauma to know this. Sometimes small repeated events suffice. Words that hurt more than you admit, moments of shame or frustration you ignored because you just wanted to keep going. Every time you didn't feel what was really there, you stored it somewhere. And eventually that storage fills up. The worst part is we get used to these signals and make them part of our identity. You start to say, "I'm just an anxious person," when in truth you're someone who never had the chance to express your fear healthily. You say, "I'm easily irritated," when all you carry is a mountain of unspoken frustration. You define yourself by your symptoms because it's easier than confronting their real root. For a long time, I told myself that time heals all wounds. A nice-sounding phrase, but an emotional trap. Time heals nothing you're not willing to truly look at and work through. You can let years, even decades pass, and still react the same when someone touches the wound you thought long ago had healed. You can change cities, jobs, partners, and still find yourself in the same conflicts, with the same emptiness, the same dissatisfaction that has become your everyday life. Your body, the silent witness of your story, will keep sending signals until you decide to do something different. You can ignore them, numb them, rationalize them, but they will stay. Not to torment you, but because they are the only language your system has left to get your attention. I remember precisely when I truly understood this. It wasn't an inspiring book or a moving speech. It was an ordinary day when everything seemed fine. I was in a meeting talking about trivial matters when suddenly that pressure in my chest appeared, as if the air got heavier from one second to the next, for no reason, with no trigger. In the past, I'd have taken a deep breath, sipped some water, plastered on a smile. But that day, I was tired of pretending everything was okay. I stood up, went to the bathroom, and stared at my reflection for minutes. For the first time, I really asked myself, what have I been carrying around here for so long? The answer didn't come immediately, but that moment marked the start of a process that changed my life. I began writing down things I'd repressed for years, voicing out loud what I'd never allowed myself to say. I let tears fall without shame. It wasn't pleasant. It didn't happen quickly. But each time I allowed myself to be honest, I felt that inner knot loosen a bit more. Since then, I've understood. My body is not my enemy. It's not sabotaging me, not punishing me. It's only trying to protect me in its own way. And if you stop fighting it, if you truly start to listen, something shifts. The tension eases. The reactions weaken. The exhaustion suddenly makes sense. And amid this uncomfortable process, a new space emerges, an inner place where you can finally breathe again, without feeling the weight of a lifetime on your shoulders. This chapter isn't a magic cure. I won't tell you that recognizing the problem is enough to make it disappear. But I can guarantee one thing. The first real step toward healing doesn't begin in the mind. It begins the moment you stop ignoring what your body has been silently telling you for years. Chapter 2. What you think you've overcome is waiting for you in another form. There are moments in life when you believe you've finally moved past something. You breathe easier, feel lighter, freer, almost as if you've left a long battle behind. You tell others you've closed that chapter, that the old story no longer affects you, that you're done with it. And maybe you even believe it, at least for a while. But then one day, completely ordinary, the unexpected happens. A conversation, a stranger's expression, a situation that vaguely reminds you of back then. Before you know it, you react. Your heart races. Your thoughts spiral. You feel a wave of emotion so intense you wonder where it came from. And before you can grasp it, you realize what you were so sure you'd left behind was never truly gone. I remember a moment like that. I was convinced I'd processed an old disappointment. For years, I'd told myself it no longer affected me, that I'd moved on. Yet when I found myself in a totally different context with people who had nothing to do with my past, a reaction erupted inside me that even surprised me. It was as if my body had stored how to feel, think, and act in those moments, regardless of how logically my mind had closed the case. I was embarrassed. I'd worked so hard on myself, had conversations, read books, tried to understand myself. But therein lay the problem. Just because we intellectually understand something doesn't mean we've emotionally resolved it. The head can find explanations, can rewrite the story to make it palatable. But the body, it stores the original version, the unvarnished, the raw, the one you can't sugarcoat. And so we experience the same patterns in new packaging. The conflict that began with your parents reappears in your relationship with a partner. The disappointment from back then mirrors itself in your reaction to your boss. The injustice you felt as a child flares up when someone criticizes you among friends. It's as if life is sending you the same lesson again, just with different actors and a slightly altered set. Many people chalk this up to bad luck or to always ending up with the wrong people. But the truth is often both simpler and more painful. As long as we haven't truly healed an inner wound, it will confront us in various forms, again and again. Not because the universe wants to punish you, but because deep down you carry an open process that demands closure. It took me a long time to accept this. It's uncomfortable to admit you're not as far along as you thought. That self-work doesn't end with one aha moment or a good therapy session. It's a process with layers, and every layer you peel back brings the next to light. I remember a phase when I tried to sidestep this mechanism. I wanted to advance quickly, to be done, to tick off the uncomfortable topics like items on a to-do list. But that impatience always brought me back to square one. I wondered why, despite all my insights, I kept repeating the same mistakes. Why, in stressful moments, I slipped back into old patterns. Why I overreacted to certain triggers when I'd understood so much. The answer was sobering, yet liberating. It's not about how much you know. It's about whether you've resolved it in your body, in your nervous system, in your emotional memory. And that rarely happens overnight. There comes a moment when you must decide whether to be honest with yourself or keep pretending everything is fine. Whether you're ready to go deeper, to feel what you've been avoiding, to acknowledge that anger, grief, disappointment, or fear still live somewhere inside, not as enemies, but as parts of you that never had a proper goodbye. Back then, I started observing exactly when I reacted most strongly, noticing when I shut down internally, defended myself, fled, or attacked. And every time the trail was clear. It wasn't about the present situation. It was about something older, unresolved, something I thought I'd long since left behind. And that's the trap so many of us fall into. We build layers of protection, become experts at convincing ourselves we're stable, that we've got the past under control. But the real test isn't how poised you are in good times. It's how you respond when your system is challenged, when your old pain memory is activated, when you're shown, here's something still open. I'm not saying this to discourage you. On the contrary, there is enormous power in realizing that every setback, every overreaction, every perceived regression is actually an invitation, an opportunity to go a step deeper, to become even more honest, to free yourself from something you've carried far too long. There's no shortcut through this process. No affirmation that will heal you in 3 days. No technique to make you a new person overnight. What exists is the chance to move forward a bit with every conscious moment, slowly but sustainably. And that is the path that truly brings change. Not skipping steps, but walking through them mindfully, with all that entails, resistance, doubt, exhaustion, and at the end, a clarity you couldn't have imagined before. When I now face emotionally challenging situations, I react differently. Not perfectly, but more consciously. I notice sooner when my system is slipping into old patterns, and I give myself the space to look before I act. Life will continue to send you tests, not because you failed, but because it's time to heal at a deeper level. What you believe you've overcome will keep resurfacing in new forms as long as it remains unresolved within you. And that is the real task, not to run away, not to sugarcoat, but to look, and then step by step, truly let go. Chapter 3. The language you use when no one is listening. There is a kind of language we all use without really thinking about it. Words we never speak out loud, that we wouldn't tell anyone else because they sound too harsh, too resigned, or too shameful. These sentences run quietly in the background, somewhere between thoughts and feelings, barely noticeable yet always present. And this inner dialogue wields more power over our lives than we realize. For a long time, I didn't see how much my own inner language influenced me. Not the words I used with others, but the ones I heard only in the moments I was alone. Morning when the alarm rings, and I ask myself if I even want to get up. Evening when I replay the day and silently blame myself for what I didn't accomplish. Whenever something goes wrong and my reflexive thought is, well, of course that happened to me again. No one but me hears these sentences. No one knows how often I belittle myself, question my abilities, or tell myself I couldn't manage anyway. And that's what makes this language so dangerous. It remains unchecked, seeps into every area of life, and slowly, almost stealthily, embeds itself in my reality. At some point, I started listening closely to what I was telling myself all day long, and the discovery was sobering. There was far more criticism than motivation, far more doubt than trust, far more devaluation than recognition. Even when everything objectively went well, I subconsciously searched for the catch, the mistake, proof that it wouldn't last. What shocked me most was realizing this inner language already shaped my behavior. I canceled appointments so I wouldn't embarrass myself. I didn't apply for jobs I wanted because I'd already decided I wouldn't get them. I withdrew emotionally before anyone could reject me. And each time I held myself back, I confirmed my own story. I'm not good enough. It will never work. Why would it work for me? This constant repetition does something to us. It programs us in ways deeper than we think. Because the body listens too. Each time I tell myself I'm going to fail, my nervous system reacts. My pulse changes, muscles tense, breathing shallows. The body prepares for exactly what I mentally sketch out. And this is where it becomes dangerous. We start living in that inner language as if it's the truth. We stop questioning it. We accept it as given. And the more we repeat it, the more firmly it roots. I realized this most when I tried one day to speak a positive sentence out loud. I can do this. The moment I said it, I felt inner resistance. My body didn't believe a word, because it had heard other sentences for so long. Because that quiet, disparaging voice inside seemed more believable than a newly minted optimism. It's not enough to stand in front of the mirror now and then and recite positive affirmations if the rest of your day is filled with self-doubt. The dialogue with yourself isn't a short-term project. It's a long-term relationship you must build. And it doesn't start with loud pep talks, but with honestly observing what you tell yourself throughout the day. I started questioning my inner monologues, not by immediately replacing them, but by first noticing them. When I thought, "You're running late again," I asked myself, is that really true? Or am I just tired? When I thought, "You'll mess this up anyway," I paused and wondered if I could actually prove that. Most of the time I couldn't. And that's where change begins, not with force, but with awareness, with the choice to stop believing every thought, with the courage to question yourself even when it's uncomfortable. It's not about instantly turning every negative thought into a positive one. It's about honestly recognizing how you speak to yourself when no one's listening, whether you give yourself space, support yourself, or sabotage yourself. Whether you'd offer a friend the same words you give yourself when they're struggling. I learned that change doesn't come through radical self-optimization. It begins quietly, in the small moments, in how you talk to yourself when you make a mistake, when you look in the mirror, when you wake up and choose how to think about yourself. And the more aware you become, the more you begin to craft new sentences, not out of compulsion, but because they start to feel right, because you sense you want to write a different story about yourself. It's a process requiring patience and honesty. But each time you choose to speak more kindly, understandingly, and supportively to yourself, you change not only your inner world, but also how you move through the world. Inner dialogue isn't a sidebar. It's the main switch. And when you consciously take control of it, you open doors you've kept locked, quietly, yet powerfully, giving yourself a voice that carries you, even when no one else is listening. Chapter 4. The Biology of a Toxic Thought. It's easy to dismiss thoughts as something fleeting, mere words in our head, not real enough to affect the body. But here lies one of our biggest misconceptions. A thought is never just a thought. It's a trigger, an instruction, a chemical reaction that, the more we repeat it, penetrates our body deeper and leaves traces we can no longer ignore. It took me a long time to grasp this. To me, worries, self-doubt, or those little moments of inner critique seemed no more than mental distractions, things that would dissipate by the next hour. Then came the first physical signals, sleep disturbances, a persistent inner unease that diffused chest tightness I couldn't breathe away. I convinced myself it was stress, work, or external circumstances, until I began to listen more closely. And the deeper I went, the clearer it became. The origin was in my head, but the effect was already in my body. Every toxic thought we think is like a drop falling into a glass. At first, we barely notice it, but over time the glass fills, and eventually it overflows. What starts as harmless self-criticism morphs into chronically elevated cortisol levels, a nervous system permanently on alert, muscles tensed as if gearing up for real danger, even though the threat was nothing more than the words we whispered to ourselves. I recall a phase when my thoughts were almost entirely negative scenarios. Hardly had I opened my eyes in the morning before the inner programs ran. What if something goes wrong today? What if I fail? What if I'm not good enough? These lines became so familiar I stopped questioning them. They were like background noise, constant, ever present. And that's what made them so dangerous. Because our brain cannot distinguish between what we imagine and what actually happens. If I visualize failure, my body releases stress hormones as though the threat were real. My pulse quickens, my breathing shallows, digestion slows. My system believes it must go into survival mode. And the more I loop these thoughts, the more entrenched those physical response patterns become. The tragic part is, we eventually acclimate to this state. We normalize the constant pressure in our chest, the insomnia, the irritability. We accept perpetual exhaustion as normal, without understanding its source. And as we keep functioning, working, smiling, those toxic thoughts burrow ever deeper, like a low-grade chronic infection. I began observing exactly when my body reacted most strongly, which thoughts threw it into crisis mode. And the more conscious I became, the clearer the patterns emerged. It was never the big external disasters that threw me off balance, but the small everyday self-attacks, those quiet sentences I whispered so casually I hardly noticed them. You're not good enough. You'll mess this up anyway. Why would it work for you? Every time I thought such thoughts, my body responded accordingly, sometimes with palpitations, sometimes with a queasy stomach, sometimes with that leaden fatigue that hit like an unstoppable wave. I slowly realized, my body is the mirror of my inner dialogue. It hears every word and believes every story I tell it. This isn't about positive thinking in the naive sense of just think happy thoughts and everything's fine. It's about honestly recognizing the emotional and physical price we pay when we allow toxic thoughts free rein. It's about taking responsibility for what we feed ourselves daily, not through words spoken outwardly, but through the stories we repeat inwardly. The path out of this spiral doesn't start with a radical vow to think only positive tomorrow. It starts with a conscious pause, the moment you first notice how often you belittle yourself, how often you attack yourself without realizing it. It's about switching off autopilot and actively choosing which thoughts you let in and which you interrupt before they take hold. I began interrupting myself at those moments. Whenever "you can't do this" rose in my mind, I'd stop, breathe deeply, and ask, is this really true? Can I prove it? Most of the time, the answer was no. And although it felt strange at first to stop these thoughts, it got easier over time. Each time I chose not to follow a toxic thought, I sent a new signal through my nervous system, a small but vital message that I would no longer allow my own words to destroy my emotional balance. This process isn't a sprint. It's a long-term shift that demands patience and mindfulness. But with every conscious moment you choose to observe your thoughts and understand their impact on your body, you reclaim a bit more control. It's the daily decision not to expose yourself to constant inner poisoning. And the more often you choose differently, the more tangible the change becomes. Not only in your mind, but throughout your entire body. Chapter 5. Emotional water, what you carry that you can't name. There are feelings we can clearly name: anger, sadness, fear, joy. Terms we learn to categorize because they're socially recognized, because we know when and how they arise. But what about the rest? That undefinable heaviness that sometimes hits us out of nowhere? The inner restlessness without a clear trigger? The pressure in the chest that is neither pain nor fear, but simply there? It took me a long time to realize we store emotions for which we lack the words, feelings that exist between known categories, things we've repressed, ignored, or never fully processed. Emotional residue that slowly, almost imperceptibly, accumulates in our body like water stagnating in a basin for years without our noticing. It often begins in childhood, moments when we weren't taught to label our feelings, when no one helped us understand what was happening inside. So we swallowed them, buried them deep. And each time, another layer formed. Another layer formed with every unspoken word, every held back tear, every stifled scream. This emotional water doesn't remain invisible. It shows up as sudden irritability without cause, fatigue that doesn't abate after 8 hours of sleep, physical tension that feels as if it's become part of you over the years. We call it back pain, tight shoulders, stress. But the truth is, it's emotional weight, stored, compressed, never released. I remember days when I felt I would overflow inside without knowing why. I would sit completely still, sensing something coil in me, without having a name for it. It wasn't classic fear. It wasn't sadness. It was just too much. Too much of everything I'd ever suppressed, unexpressed, unprocessed. We humans excel at bypassing ourselves. We function because life demands it. We smile because it's expected. We ignore signals because they come at inconvenient times. And every time we override our inner voice, the pressure grows. Eventually, a single sentence, a tiny disappointment, a minor conflict. Everything we've repressed for years bursts forth. Often uncontrollably, often with an intensity that scares even us. What I understood at this point is that our body is like a reservoir for everything we emotionally won't let go. And as with any overflowing basin, there are only two options: find a way to release the water in a controlled manner, or risk a breach, an unexpected, uncontrollable overflow. My turning point came when I accepted that I didn't have to name everything to feel it, that it was okay to simply sit with that inner weight and give it space, without immediately seeking explanations or solutions, just noticing what was there. That felt difficult, almost uncomfortable at first. I'd always believed I had to understand before I could let go, but sometimes healing lies not in understanding, but in feeling. I began to intentionally connect with that layer in still moments, trying to sense exactly where it sat. In a tight throat, a heavy belly, a constricting chest. And each time I truly allowed myself to feel it, I noticed something loosen. Nothing dramatic, but perceptible. Sometimes memories surfaced. Small, seemingly insignificant incidents I'd long forgotten. Moments that didn't seem important then, yet had stuck because I couldn't process them at the time. Today I know. This emotional water we carry is not our enemy. It's part of us crying out to be seen, longing to flow free so there's room again, for lightness, for new experiences, for genuine inner peace. I stopped judging myself for this burden. I learned to accept it without getting lost in it. I understood it was the result of how I treated myself for years, and that I had the responsibility to release it gradually. It's a process that takes time, demands patience and courage to look again and again, even when it's uncomfortable. But with every step I took, the inner basin grew a bit emptier. And what filled it afterwards wasn't emptiness, but space. Space for myself. Space for new stories not shaped by repressed emotions. In the end, it's not about perfectly understanding every emotion or sorting it neatly into categories. It's about meeting yourself honestly, feeling what wants to be felt, and refusing to let your body serve as an emotional landfill any longer. Chapter 6. The day you decide to end your loyalty to pain. There's that one moment that doesn't announce itself. It doesn't come dramatically, with grand gestures or loud epiphanies. It arrives quietly, almost unnoticed. And yet it changes everything. It's the moment you start to wonder whether you've stayed loyal for far too long to a pain that has long since destroyed you more than it has shaped you. I remember exactly when that point came for me. It wasn't a special day. No crisis, no catastrophe. Just an ordinary evening, sitting on my couch in a room that felt familiar, with thoughts I'd turned over 1,000 times before. And that's precisely what hit me. The realization of how much energy I had poured into the same emotional pattern for years. Again and again. Without pause. Almost like a never-ending loop. Pain can become a habit, an identity. Something we get so used to that we don't even know what it would be like to live without it. We define ourselves by it. We tell our story over and over in the same words, with the same emphasis, as if it were part of our character. And with every retelling, we dig ourselves deeper into that role. The role of the wounded, of the victim, of the one who was wronged. For a long time, I convinced myself that this pain was justified, that I needed it to shield me from further disappointment, that it made me strong because it had formed me. But in truth, it was that very pain that kept me small, that prevented me from truly being free. It was like an anchor I hammered into the ground myself, all the while complaining about feeling stuck. There is a perverse form of loyalty we develop toward our own pain. We defend it, justify it, make it the centerpiece of our story. Not because we want to suffer, but because it's become familiar. Because it taught us how to survive. Because we don't know who we'd be if we let it go. I realized I was more afraid of living without that pain than of carrying it with me. Who am I if I'm no longer the one who was hurt? Who am I if I stop cycling through this endless loop of disappointment and self-pity? The day you decide to end that loyalty feels at first like a betrayal of yourself, of your story, of the journey you've endured. It feels like giving up something that has been your companion all these years, but that is precisely the beginning of freedom. I recall my first attempts to truly detach from that pain. It felt like running into an inner wall. The thoughts still came. The memories remained. The old reactions tried to switch themselves back on. But I stayed put. I breathed. And I consciously chose not to slip back into the familiar pattern. It wasn't a grand victory. It was a quiet, inner moment of clarity. One that had to be repeated again and again, day after day, sometimes hour after hour, whenever my mind started telling me again how badly I'd been treated, how unfair life was, how deep the wound still sat. And over time, it grew easier. Not because the pain vanished, but because I learned not to give it the same power. I stopped feeding it. I stopped using it as an excuse for my behavior. I stopped letting it explain why I wouldn't take certain steps, why I sabotaged relationships, why I undermined myself. I began to ask what lay behind all that pain. What parts of me were waiting to be lived once pain was no longer center stage. And the more I leaned into that question, the more I felt there is a life beyond the pain, one I'd never truly entered until then. This process isn't about sugarcoating the past or forgetting what happened. It's about choosing not to remain stuck in it, recognizing that there is no medal for enduring, and no one will come and congratulate you for replaying the same inner drama for years. The day you decide to end your loyalty to pain is the day you breathe freely again, deeply and unblocked. It's the moment you begin to look forward, even if it feels unfamiliar at first, even if the emptiness that pain leaves behind startles you. I learned to welcome that emptiness. It's not a loss, it's space. Space for new thoughts, new feelings, new decisions. Space for a version of myself that no longer defines itself by what happened, but by what I make of it. And that is my wish for you, that you recognize when it's time to release yourself from this imprisonment, that you find the courage to let go, even when it hurts, because on the other side of letting go awaits something greater than anything you've allowed yourself to feel so far: the freedom to reinvent yourself. Chapter 7. The Cycle of Self-Sabotage. How and why you block yourself. Sometimes you stand on a threshold, not literally but inwardly. You sense change coming. You're so close to taking a step that could move you forward, a decision long overdue. Maybe it's a career change, a relationship you need to start or finally end, or a project you've been postponing for years. And while every part of you knows now is the moment to go for it, something else happens. Suddenly you find reasons why this step isn't sensible right now. You start getting lost in details that never mattered before. You delay decisions to tomorrow, next week, someday. And before you know it, you've placed yourself back at square one. I experienced this mechanism in myself far too often, long before I even knew it had a name. Self-sabotage sounds like something you do on purpose, as if you consciously work against yourself. But that's not what it is. It's a quiet process that sneaks into your thoughts, your routines, your decisions, or rather, your non-decisions. The fear of failure is just one piece of it. Even deeper is the fear of change itself. Because change always brings uncertainty, risk, the possibility things won't go the way you know. And that alone is enough to trigger your system's alarm, that ancient self-protection mechanism urging you to stay in what's familiar, even when it's no longer good for you. I remember one particular moment vividly. I was about to accept a job offer that met every wish I had. The terms were right. The role matched my skills perfectly. Yet, there I was, an hour before signing, searching for reasons this might be a bad idea. I Googled potential pitfalls, calculated everything that could go wrong, recalled every past failure. And the longer I thought, the more convinced I became that I should back away. At the time, I told myself it was prudence. Today, I know it was fear and pure self-sabotage. These patterns often operate so quietly that we don't recognize them as problems. They disguise themselves as responsibility, realism, healthy caution. But in truth, they block our growth. Every time you hold yourself back, you strengthen the neural pathways responsible for that fear. Your brain learns. Withdrawal means safety, and each repetition makes it harder to choose differently next time. I eventually realized I was afraid not only of failure, but also of success, because success means change. It means new expectations from others, new challenges, having to redefine myself. And back then, that was too much for me. Self-sabotage takes countless forms: procrastination, excessive self-criticism, a pursuit of perfection that leaves you paralyzed, avoiding conflict, shoving decisions into the future, or burying yourself in endless analysis that only deepens the standstill. The most insidious aspect is how we lie to ourselves to avoid confronting it. I often told myself the timing wasn't right, that I wasn't ready, that I needed more preparation or had to feel stronger inside before acting. But deep down, I knew those were just excuses. The turning point came when I stopped seeing these patterns as personality traits and started treating them as learned responses. I began to observe myself slipping into excuses and asked, what would really happen if I went for it anyway? Despite the fear, the uncertainty, the inner resistance. And the more often I chose action in those moments, the more something shifted within me. I noticed that even though my body still reacted, heart racing, nerves jangling, that hollow feeling in my stomach, I remained capable of action. I could make decisions without dissecting every worst-case scenario in excruciating detail. Self-sabotage cannot be overcome by insight alone. You can read all the books you want, know exactly how your pattern works, and still remain stuck. The only way out is conscious action against your own impulse. And that's the hardest part, because in that moment, everything inside you feels wrong. Every fiber of your being screams to retreat. But if you stay in that moment and take the next step anyway, that's where change begins. I started collecting small proofs of trust in myself, moments when I acted against my fear, times I signed the contract after all, made the call, sent the application, and with each of those steps, it got a bit easier. Today I recognize the signs of self-sabotage more quickly. I notice when my mind begins looping, when I get lost in trivial tasks to avoid the important ones. And though I don't always handle it perfectly, I've learned to stop myself. It's not about never feeling fear or doubt again. It's about refusing to let these feelings control you. It's the conscious decision to keep moving forward, step by step, even when it's hard, even when the inner resistance is strong. In the end, self-sabotage is nothing more than an outdated protection mechanism you no longer need. One you can leave behind not overnight, but one moment at a time when you choose not to step back. Chapter 8. The Memory of Water. What Science Discovered and What You Ignore Every Day. When I first heard the idea that water can store information, I rolled my eyes. It sounded esoteric, too far removed from anything I'd considered scientifically credible. Water, I thought, is just water. An H2O molecule, nothing more. It quenches thirst, flows through our bodies, performs biological functions, but that's it. Yet the deeper I delved into the topic, the harder it became to dismiss it so lightly. There were experiments I couldn't easily explain away. Photographs of frozen water crystals whose shapes changed depending on what words, music, or emotions they'd been exposed to. Clear, symmetrical forms after positive messages. Jagged, chaotic patterns after negative influences. Even if the scientific community debated whether these results were reproducible or measurable enough, something stirred in me. A sense that there might be more to it than I'd admit. The longer I studied the research, the more parallels I drew. If water really can absorb and store information, what does that mean for me? For my own body, after all, we're over 70% water. Every cell, every organ, every tissue, infused with this substance that apparently can do more than transport and cleanse. I recalled phases in my life when I'd been trapped in a certain emotional state. Weeks, sometimes months of stress, fear, or inner tension. And when I was honest with myself, I had to admit that my entire physical condition changed during those stretches. My skin, my sleep, my digestion, even my energy levels. Now, armed with the idea of water's memory, it all took on a new dimension. The notion that every thought, every feeling, every spoken word generates a vibration that influences my body's internal environment wouldn't let go. I imagined how my own internal water had stored what I fed it over the years. Self-doubt, worry, constant self-reproach, each as information, an energetic imprint in every cell. I began to pay attention to my inner dialogue, how often I looped in thoughts that did nothing but create tension. And as I faced this, I realized it isn't about whispering a few affirmations to your water or chanting over your morning glass. It's about a fundamental attitude toward yourself, the way you communicate with your body every day, every hour. Science may still argue about how far water's memory truly reaches, but my own experience, my body's signals, were unmistakable. I could no longer ignore what my system had been telling me for years through symptoms, tension, and exhaustion. I started weaving small rituals into my day. Not grand staged moments, but simple acts carried out with new awareness. Before drinking my first glass of water in the morning, I paused. I checked in on what I wanted to imbibe today, not as a magic ceremony, but as a conscious decision. I didn't speak aloud to the water, but I formed clear intentions in my mind. Today, I choose lightness, or I'm ready to release old burdens. And even if it seemed silly to an outsider, for me it was the first authentic step toward a new relationship with myself. I noticed shifts in my bodily sense, not overnight, but perceptibly. It felt as if my system was beginning to understand. I'm ready to rewrite old programs bit by bit. Of course, there were setbacks, days when old patterns overpowered my newfound mindfulness, moments I slipped back into autopilot of self-criticism and tension. But each time I paused and reset, I felt, it's worth it. What fascinates me most is the idea that our body doesn't just communicate via symptoms. It's also receptive to every conscious shift in our inner language. If water can store information, it also holds on to the new impulses we give it. Every choice for compassion, for self-care, for a fresh attitude leaves a trace. I stopped waiting for definitive proof from science. I began treating myself as my own experiment. My body, my emotional system, my energy levels, showing me daily how deeply my inner state affects how I feel. Maybe in a few years we'll know more about water's memory. Perhaps skepticism will remain. But for me, what matters is this: taking responsibility for what I feed into my system, into my thoughts, words, emotions. Because each day, each hour, each minute, I can choose whether to program my inner water with fear, guilt, and self-criticism, or to tell it a different story. And that is where real change begins. Chapter 9. You're 70% water, but what are you programming into yourself? When you realize over 2/3 of your body is water, at first glance it seems a purely biological fact, something you learned in biology class and then quickly forgot. But the longer I pondered it, the clearer its true significance became. It's not just about how much we drink or staying hydrated. It's a much bigger question. What information am I storing, day after day, in that vast, liquid part of my body? I often caught myself drifting through the day on autopilot, chatting, texting, brooding, unaware of how many of my thoughts and emotions were tinted by stress, anger, or anxiety. Then, exhausted on the couch at night, I'd wonder why my body felt so heavy, why my muscles ached though I'd been sitting all day, why my head throbbed though nothing specific had happened. Now I know it wasn't external circumstances. It was how I treated myself internally. Every phrase I told myself, every self-judgment, every fear looped inside, stored in my system, in my nervous system. And yes, probably in every water cell that keeps me alive. I began to watch how I spoke to myself, not just in overt moments of self-criticism, but in tiny, automatic thoughts. When I stood before the mirror each morning and my first thought was, "You look tired and worn out," or when faced with a task at work, I immediately thought, "You're never going to manage this." These sentences seem harmless, almost trivial, but therein lies the danger. Because they repeat, they nestle in, and with each repetition, they embed deeper in my system. I started wondering what might happen if I programmed my inner water with something else: understanding, patience, compassion. Not in some over-the-top optimism or empty slogans, but pragmatically, through deliberate choices in my thoughts and words. First, I stopped punishing myself for what I hadn't achieved. Instead of berating myself at day's end, I made a practice of consciously noting moments I did well. Times I stayed calm despite irritation. Instances when I was honest, even if it felt uncomfortable. Of course, change didn't happen overnight. Some days I still slipped into old patterns. But the difference now is, I notice it. I hear it. I feel when I'm programming myself negatively, and in those moments, I have the choice to do something different. I also realized how much my environment shaped this inner programming. People who speak constantly about negativity, conversations that fixate on problems, media that fuels fear and uncertainty. These are sources of information my body absorbs, often unwillingly. And the more I looked at it, the clearer it became. My body has no choice but to store what I feed it. Every thought, every feeling, every frequency. So I began curating my environment more mindfully. Not by shutting myself off, but by asking, what nourishes me? Which conversations encourage me to speak kindly to myself? And conversely, where do I get lost in negative energy that weighs me down, leaving me feeling like a leaden weight in my own body? Music became a tool too. Not as distraction, but as a deliberate choice of which vibrations I allowed into me. I imagined each melody, each frequency, directly affecting my internal water, releasing tension or unlocking fresh energy. And once again, the impact was tangible in my body, even if not measurable by science. Gradually, my self-image shifted. I stopped defining myself solely by achievement or external validation. I began to see myself as a system on constant reception, and realizing I control what information I feed into it. Now, on stressful days, I don't just ask if I've had enough water. I also ask, what have I energetically given my inner water today? Was it trust, calm, gratitude, or anger, stress, relentless self-criticism? This newfound awareness has changed my daily life, not through grand gestures or elaborate rituals, but through many small decisions. A kinder thought in the morning, a conscious mindset before a challenge, a moment's reflection before slipping into worry again. What I've learned. Change doesn't start out there. It starts right here, within me, in my mind, in my heart, and yes, in every water cell waiting for me to tell it a different narrative than the one of fear, doubt, and self-sabotage I jammed into it for far too long. Chapter 10. How to break patterns when no one ever taught you how. You grow up, live your life, make choices, stumble, fall, get up again, and eventually wonder why certain things keep repeating. Why you end up in relationships that always feel the same. Why you hit the same walls at work. Why inner dissatisfaction persists no matter how much you change your outer circumstances. And the more you struggle, the more you feel you're going in circles. For a long time, I believed something was wrong with me. That I just wasn't disciplined enough, not strong enough, not smart enough to finally break these damned patterns. I saw others who apparently moved forward effortlessly while I failed at the same exact points. It felt as if I were perpetually running into a wall built just for me. It took me a long time to realize it's not about being stronger or smarter. It's about first recognizing that you're stuck in a pattern. And that's hard when no one ever taught you how to do that. When you never learned to question your own behaviors. When no one showed you could respond differently than you always had. Our patterns aren't accidents. They're programs we unconsciously learned over years. Reactions to pain, to fear, to uncertainty. They once served as survival strategies but now keep us stuck, fooling us into thinking they offer security even as they hold us back. I remember one of those days when I caught myself reflexively slipping into my old pattern. A small criticism from someone, and I instantly shifted into defense mode. I explained why nothing was that bad, why it wasn't my fault, why the circumstances were unfair. And while I spoke, I could feel I was losing myself again, watching myself slide back into that role I'd grown weary of. The moment I decided to stop the game wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a faint inner impulse, barely audible but suddenly present. You could simply say something different, or say nothing. And that's exactly what I did. I fell silent, stopped justifying, took a deep breath, and for the first time in ages, it didn't feel like weakness, but like freedom. Breaking patterns doesn't make them vanish instantly. They knock again. They challenge you. But each time you respond differently, you carve a new neural path in your brain, a new route. And with every conscious decision to interrupt the old response, that new path grows wider, more tangible, more familiar. What helped me was anchoring myself with brief internal reminders whenever I sensed I was about to slip back in. Phrases like, "You don't have to defend yourself now," or "Just because that's how you did it before doesn't mean you must repeat it." No grand mantras, just short, clear nudges toward the choice I had in that moment. I also started paying attention to my body's signals, my racing heartbeat, the lump in my throat when I felt criticized, the tension in my shoulders when I pressured myself. Those became my warning lights, and whenever they flickered, I knew, here's my chance to do something different. What surprised me most was how much small changes can ripple outward. A moment of silence instead of an eruption, a deep breath in place of an immediate response, a calm, "I'll get back to you," instead of instant overreaction. Those tiny decisions began to reprogram my entire system. Of course, there were setbacks, days when I reacted on autopilot and beat myself up for it afterward. But even that became less frequent as I learned not to punish myself, but to focus on choosing differently next time. Breaking patterns doesn't mean never making mistakes again. It means staying awake, refusing to look away, taking responsibility for your behavior without self-flagellation. It means allowing yourself to react in new ways, even if it feels strange at first, even if every instinct cries to return to the old, supposedly safe pattern. And that is where true freedom lies, in the realization that you are not a victim of your history, not doomed to repeat what you've learned. You have the power, every day, every moment, to make a new choice, no matter how small, no matter how insignificant it seems. I know now, the biggest step out of old patterns isn't realizing they exist. It's stopping the automatic replay. Chapter 11. The invisible burden of your family tree. There are things in our lives that we didn't choose for ourselves. Patterns, fears, reactions that rise within us without us being able to say exactly why. Behaviors that don't match our conscious decisions, yet keep showing up as if they were an inescapable part of us. For a long time, I believed this was simply down to my personality or the experiences I'd gone through myself. Until I understood that there is a level even deeper than anything I can grasp in my own biography. Our family tree is more than just a list of names and birth dates. It's an energetic web, a collection of stories, wounds, unresolved conflicts, and emotions passed down from generation to generation. Not consciously, not out of malice, but because no one ever learned another way to handle it. I remember a moment when this connection became suddenly clear to me. It was a conversation with my mother, actually trivial, almost every day. Yet all of a sudden, I heard in her words exactly the same phrases I'd been telling myself for years. The same fears, the same doubts, the same reactions to certain topics. And the more I reflected on it, the clearer it became. These patterns didn't start with me. They'd grown over decades, perhaps even centuries, and I had adopted them without noticing. The frightening part wasn't just the realization that I was carrying my family's emotional baggage unconsciously. It was the question of how much of what I'd considered my own weaknesses weren't truly mine at all. How often I'd judged myself for things whose origins lay much earlier. How many decisions I'd made under an inner pressure that didn't even stem from my own life. I began to delve deeper into my family history. Not to find someone to blame or to rip open old wounds, but to understand. To recognize the connections. Why certain emotions in our family were never spoken aloud. Why conflicts were swept under the rug or fought with exaggerated harshness. Why fear of change, of loss, or of closeness kept resurfacing. And the deeper I went, the more evident it became. I'm not the first to wrestle with these feelings, and I won't be the last, unless I change something. The moment you grasp that you're acting not only for yourself, but also for the generations to come, is one of the most powerful, and at the same time, one of the most terrifying. Suddenly, it's no longer just about your own healing, but about a responsibility that reaches beyond your own life. I learned that staying stuck in this realization serves no purpose. Getting angry about what was handed down to you doesn't move anyone forward. The real step begins the moment you decide to break the cycle, to stop carrying those stories unconsciously, to stop saying the same phrases, feeding the same fears, and living out the same behavioral patterns on autopilot. That doesn't mean everything disappears overnight. On the contrary, sometimes it even intensifies when you start looking closely. Suddenly, emotions you've suppressed for decades surface. Old images, long-forgotten memories, bodily reactions that seem to appear for no reason. Yet right here lies the key. The moment you stop seeing it all as an enemy, and instead treat it as an invitation to truly change. I remember one night waking up with a deep sadness, without any concrete trigger, without an acute reason. It was a sadness you couldn't grasp, like a layer that wasn't yours. And for the first time, I didn't push it away. I simply sat with it, breathed, let it be. And the longer I allowed it, the clearer it became. This wasn't only my pain. It was something I carried because no one before me had the courage to really feel it. Those moments taught me to be more compassionate with myself and with those who came before me. Our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, they all lived and survived with the means they had. Many of them lacked the tools to heal their own traumas. They passed on what they themselves had experienced. Not because they wanted us to suffer, but because they didn't know any better. And that is exactly where our task begins. Not in anger, not in accusation, but in the clear decision. The line ends here. The pain that has run through generations will not be carried forward. The fears, the silence, the suppressed feelings, they end here. It's not an easy path. It demands courage, honesty, and sometimes the willingness to face unpleasant feelings we've long repressed. But each step in that direction sets something in motion, not only within ourselves but throughout our entire family system. I have learned that I honor the stories of my ancestors by choosing to do things differently, by taking responsibility for my own emotional inheritance, by daring to walk new paths, even when they feel uncertain at first. And that is exactly what I wish for you. That you find the courage not to accept this invisible burden as given. That you ask yourself which feelings in your life truly belong to you, and which you've taken on out of love, loyalty, or fear. Because as soon as you begin to lay down this burden, you not only open a new path for yourself, but you also create the possibility for those who come after you to live in greater freedom. Chapter 12. The Trap of Misunderstood Endurance. We live in a world where strength is often measured by how much you can endure, how long you stay silent when something hurts, how hard you grit your teeth and carry on no matter what it costs. Be strong, they say. Hang in there, they say. And we believe it. We believe it so much that with every new setback, we hunker down even more, burying ourselves deeper in the notion that this is exactly what we must do. I remember exactly how I, for years, thought that this capacity to endure was a form of success, a virtue in itself, to withstand everything, pain, disappointment, overwhelm. I admired myself for how long I kept going, how little I showed on the outside, how often I neglected my own needs just to appear strong. And if someone ever asked me how I was really doing, I'd smile and say, "I'm fine," even when inside nothing was fine at all. But over time, exhaustion caught up with me. It didn't sneak up quietly. It hit me like a freight train. My body rebelled. My mind refused to cooperate. The smallest task became an insurmountable hurdle. I got up in the morning and didn't even know why I was getting out of bed. And still, I kept going. Another week, another month, another year, out of principle, out of misplaced pride, out of fear of what would happen if I stopped. It wasn't until one morning, standing in the bathroom, barely recognizing my reflection and thinking, I just want to give it all up, that I realized how far I had pushed myself. It wasn't strength that had brought me here. It was self-neglect and the fear of appearing weak, of disappointing others, of not being enough. Resilience is often celebrated like a superpower, as if it were the ultimate goal. Yet hardly anyone speaks about what it does to a person if they force themselves to stay strong year after year, if giving up is never an option, if pauses, retreats, or admitting weakness are seen as personal failures. I learned that true resilience has nothing to do with hardness, and certainly not with emotional numbness. It doesn't come from constantly ignoring one's own needs, but from the ability to be honest with oneself, to recognize when it's time to keep going and when it's time to pause. It was a long journey to realize this. I had to learn that it's not a weakness to ask for help, that stepping back before you collapse isn't failure, and that saying, I can't do this right now, takes more courage than soldiering on until there's nothing left of you. The biggest lie we tell ourselves is that we must manage everything on our own, that we need no one, that we function better if we isolate ourselves. But in truth, that cuts us off from the one resource that truly sustains us, genuine connection, to ourselves and to others. I still remember the day I consciously took a break, not because I was on vacation or sick, but because I decided I couldn't and didn't have to keep going. I sat on the sofa, switched off my phone, and asked myself what I really needed. The answer came slowly, but it did come. Do nothing, prove nothing, just breathe, just be. It felt strange, almost uncomfortable. My mind screamed that I was wasting time, that I couldn't let myself off the hook, that I had to pull myself together. But my body was grateful. I felt a tension release that I hadn't noticed for years. And in that moment, I realized, this is what it feels like when you start listening to yourself again. Today, I know that my worth doesn't depend on how much I endure. It's not measured by the number of crises I overcome, the amount of pain I withstand, or the ability to show no cracks. My worth shows in how I treat myself, with honesty about my limits, with willingness to seek help, and with the self-care I once reserved only for others. True strength doesn't lie in perpetual perseverance. It lies in the ability to pause, to reflect, to reach out for help, and to treat yourself with the same care you'd show those you love. It isn't about becoming soft or giving up every time things get hard. It's about recognizing the difference between genuine grit and self-destructive functioning. And that distinction will save you, not someday, but right now. Chapter 13. Emotional Reprogramming. The uncomfortable work nobody wants to do. There are phases in life when you think you've already done plenty of inner work. You've read books, listened to podcasts, maybe even attended workshops. You know the buzzwords. You understand what self-love, setting boundaries, or forgiveness mean in theory. And yet there remains this one feeling, that at the core nothing has really changed, that the old patterns are still there, ready to take over at the decisive moment. I know that exact place. I spent a long time there, head full of insights and heart full of old programs that wouldn't shake off so easily. The moment I realized that knowledge alone isn't enough was bitter, but also liberating, because I understood. Now the real work begins. The work that's uncomfortable. The work everyone wants to avoid. Emotional reprogramming. When I think back to that phase, I see myself waking up each morning and feeling in those first minutes how my body automatically slipped into old patterns. The same inner tension, the same self-critical thoughts, the same underlying fear of what the day might bring. And even if I tried to motivate myself with positive thoughts, the heaviness remained. It wasn't that I didn't know what needed to be done. That was exactly the problem. I knew it, and yet I didn't do it. Instead, I stayed stuck in that loop of insight and non-action. always hoping the breakthrough would come by itself, that one magical moment would change everything. It never came. The moment real change happened was when I stopped searching for a quick fix and understood that emotional reprogramming isn't about sudden enlightenment, but about a daily, conscious, often tedious decision, with the will to start over again and again, even when you don't feel like it, even when it hurts, even when it seems you're going nowhere. I began to observe my thoughts radically, not just now and then, but almost obsessively. I listened keenly whenever I slipped into old beliefs, whenever I judged myself internally, whenever I assumed I couldn't achieve or deserve something. And each time I caught one of those thoughts, I forced myself to stop it, not by immediately flipping it into its opposite, but simply by interrupting it. A simple stop was enough at first. The crucial thing was that I no longer let it run unnoticed. It was exhausting, draining, and often felt like fighting against myself. But that was the point. I needed to interrupt these deeply ingrained programs because they had burned themselves into my system over years. At the same time, I started reconnecting with my body, not through exercise or meditation in the classic sense, but through conscious presence. I placed a hand on my belly when I felt anxiety rising. I took deep breaths when my heart raced under inner pressure. I allowed myself, in moments when my body showed old reactions, not to flee, but to stay right there, to feel the emotion flowing instead of pushing it away as I used to. I stopped looking for motivation and relied on discipline, the simple yet powerful decision to move a tiny bit in the new direction every single day, even if it was no fun, even if the inner resistance was huge, even if nothing in me wanted to. And at some point, almost unnoticed, things began to change. My bodily reactions weakened. Negative thoughts still came, but they no longer lasted. Situations that once knocked me off balance for days, I shook off in hours. That was when I realized it works. Not dramatically, not spectacularly, but slowly, quietly, sustainably. I'll be honest, this work never ends. Even now there are days when I relapse, when old patterns speak louder than my new strategies. But the difference is that today I notice it sooner, and I don't judge myself for it. I see it as part of the process, a sign that I need to keep at it. Emotional reprogramming isn't a one-and-done task. It's daily training, a choice you make again and again, an inner stance that gradually anchors itself within you. And that is where the real change lies. Not in theory, not in knowledge, but in daily practice, in every small moment when you consciously choose not to remain a prisoner of your old thoughts and feelings. Chapter 14. Emotional silence, the place where true change begins. There are moments when you feel every fiber of your being crying out for an answer. You search for distraction, scroll through your phone, engage in meaningless conversations, put on music, turn on the TV, anything to avoid silence, because in that silence lies something you've been running from for far too long. Something that would catch up with you if you dared to sit still for even a moment. I remember a phase of my life when I fled in near panic from that inner silence. I couldn't spend a single moment alone in a quiet room without an inner restlessness overwhelming me. The quieter it got around me, the louder it got inside. Thoughts I'd successfully suppressed would surge to the surface. Memories I'd pushed away would return with an intensity that left me breathless. And that was exactly the point when I began to understand that true answers don't lie in more activity, not in the next project or conversation with friends, but precisely in the silence where it becomes uncomfortable, where all masks fall away, where there's no filter between what you feel and what you've long repressed. Fear, anger, grief, they all suddenly find a voice. That's why we avoid this state at all costs. I learned that there's a difference between outer quiet and inner silence. You can sit in a silent place without being truly silent inside. If your mind keeps racing, if thoughts keep circling, if you're still struggling internally, you haven't reached true silence. The real moment comes only when you stop fighting what arises within, when you stop analyzing, stop judging, stop running away, and simply be. The first times were brutal. I'd sit there with closed eyes, and everything in me would scream to burst into activity, to put on music, check messages, do anything but face the silence. Yet the longer I stayed, the more I sensed. Beyond the fear lay something else, a clarity only visible in silence. I began recognizing the true patterns I carried, not those I thought I had, but the ones revealed in those silent moments. Deep-seated beliefs, feelings long overwritten. And where I would once have fled, this time I stayed. Emotional silence became my toughest teacher, confronting me with truths I'd long avoided. It showed me how often I acted from fear, how many decisions I made not from freedom but from inner pressure. It brought me to a point where I had to understand. Real change doesn't happen while we keep running outward. It happens right here, right now, when we let go of everything we thought we needed to control. I started carving out small pockets of time for this silence every day. Not for hours, not in elaborate rituals, but simply 10 minutes of sitting, eyes closed, doing nothing but sensing what's there. No phone, no music, no plan, just me with myself. And in those moments I experienced the deepest inner shifts, not because something spectacular happened, but because I finally listened to myself. Because I let emotions be without immediately pushing them away or analyzing them. What surprised me most was realizing that silence doesn't only hold pain. It also hides gratitude, clarity, and even a profound peace. To find them, you have to be willing to pass through the uncomfortable layers, through restlessness, through fear, through old inner stories. I stopped fearing silence. It's not an enemy. It's the place where everything realigns, where I can discern what truly belongs to me and what I've only inherited, where I learn to distinguish genuine needs from learned reactions. Today I know. Every time I face this silence, I build something within me that no one can take away. A stability that doesn't depend on how loud or chaotic the outside world is. A clarity that's there when I need it most. And that is the beginning of any real transformation. Not the loud changes, not the big external decisions, but the quiet moment when you finally dare to listen. Chapter 15. The brutal power of the spoken word. There are moments when a single sentence changes everything, not because its content is so surprising, but because it's finally spoken. Because the words that have been stuck inside us take shape, gain an edge, a force we underestimated. I've experienced this more than once, and each time the effect was stronger than I expected. For a long time I believed thoughts were harmless, as long as they stayed in my head. That anything unspoken had no real impact. But that was my greatest error. Unspoken thoughts accumulate, piling up like an invisible weight that grows heavier each day. And eventually a minor trigger, a small argument or remark, sets it all off in a way you can neither control nor undo. I remember one evening in the middle of a conversation when I suddenly said things I'd harbored for years. Raw, unfiltered, hurtful. And once those words were out, there was that moment of stunned silence. One fractional second when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. Although it brought relief to finally say it, what lingered was a bitter aftertaste, because words have a power we too often underestimate. But here lies another truth I long refused to see. Words can destroy, but they can also set you free. It all depends on when and how we use them. I learned there's a huge difference between blurting something out in an impulsive rage and deliberately, calmly expressing what's in my heart. The first times I tried to truly speak up, my voice trembled. My body was on high alert. I felt resistance in my chest, shaking hands, fear of my partner's reaction. Yet each word I dared to speak made the burden a little lighter. Not because everything changed instantly, but because I finally took myself seriously. Because I stopped hiding behind silence. This isn't about saying everything that pops into your mind. It's about voicing what must finally be said, the truths that have been trapped inside and make us sick when we keep swallowing them. I came to understand that fear of others' reactions often mirrors my own insecurity. I'd walked through conflicts in silence, believing harmony was more important than honesty. That pattern cost me more energy than any open fight ever could. The moment I first voiced how deeply certain behaviors hurt me was a turning point. Not because everything changed from that point on, but because I proved to myself that my feelings have a voice, that they deserve space, that I no longer have to play the role of the silent endurer. Of course, there were times my words weren't well received. Conversations that ended in arguments, people responding with rejection or misunderstanding. Yet even then I felt a quiet confidence, because I knew I had stood up for myself, no longer part of a game where I constantly put my own needs last. I've also seen how words can build bridges once thought impossible. How one honest sentence can create more connection than 1,000 polite niceties. How doors open when you dare to speak your truth. Those talks were rarely easy, but they were real, and that changed me. Over time, I learned to distinguish between impulse and clarity. Not every feeling needs immediate expression. Sometimes it's better to pause, sort your emotions, and then calmly say what needs to be said. But what no longer works is endless silence, endless endurance, endless swallowing. My greatest lesson was realizing that spoken words affect us internally as well as externally. Every time I dare to speak my truth, I reprogram my own system. I make space, release tension, give myself permission to be heard. And in that lies the brutal, but also the most healing power of the spoken word. It makes visible what long remained unseen, forces you to take a stand, shakes up stuck situations, and changes the dynamic, whether for better or for challenge. Today I know silence doesn't protect me. It imprisons me. And every time I choose to use my voice, I reclaim a piece of what I lost through years of silent endurance. My clarity, my self-respect, and the respect for my own truth. Chapter 15. The brutal power of the spoken word. There are moments when a single sentence changes everything, not because its content is so surprising, but because it's finally spoken. The words that have been stuck inside us for so long suddenly take shape, gaining an edge and force we underestimated. I've experienced this more than once, and each time the impact was stronger than I expected. For a long time I believed thoughts were harmless, as long as they stayed in my head, that anything unspoken had no real effect. But that was my greatest mistake. Unspoken thoughts accumulate, building up like an invisible weight that grows heavier every day. And sooner or later, a trivial trigger, a small argument, an offhand remark, sets it all off in a way you can neither control nor undo. I remember one evening in the middle of a conversation when I suddenly blurted out things I had carried inside me for years. Raw, unfiltered, hurtful words. And once they were out, there was that moment of stunned silence. That split second when you realize you've crossed a line you can't uncross. Though it felt like a relief to finally let it all out, what followed was a bitter aftertaste. Because words have a power we too often underestimate. But in that lies another truth I long refused to see. Words can destroy, but they can also set us free. It all depends on when and how we use them. I've learned there's a massive difference between hurling something out in an impulsive burst of anger and calmly, clearly expressing what's going on inside me. The first few times I tried to really speak my mind, my voice was unsteady and cracking. My whole body went on high alert. I felt a tightness in my chest, My hands trembled, and I feared how the other person would react. Yet with every word I nevertheless spoke, the burden lightened. Not because everything was fixed immediately, but because I took myself seriously. I stopped hiding behind silence. This isn't about saying every fleeting thought out loud. It's about speaking what truly needs to be said. The sentences that have been trapped inside us. The unspoken truths that make us sick when we keep swallowing them. I realized that fear of others' reactions often mirrors my own insecurity. For years, I endured conflicts in silence because I believed harmony was more important than honesty, and that cost me far more energy than any open fight ever could. The moment I first spoke up about how deeply certain behaviors hurt me was a turning point, not because everything changed right away, but because I proved to myself that my feelings have a voice, deserve space, and that I no longer have to play the silent sufferer. Of course, there were times my words weren't well received. Conversations that ended in arguments, people responding with rejection or misunderstanding. Yet even then, I felt a calm inside, because I knew I had stood up for myself and was no longer part of a game in which my needs always came last. I've also seen how words can build bridges once thought impossible, how one honest sentence creates more connection than 1,000 polite platitudes, how doors open when you dare to say what you really think and feel. Those talks were often difficult, but they were genuine, and that changed me. Over time, I learned to distinguish between impulse and clarity. Not every feeling needs immediate expression. Sometimes it's better to pause, sort out your emotions, and then speak with composure. But what no longer works is endless silence, endless endurance, endless swallowing. The greatest lesson for me was realizing that spoken words affect us internally as well as externally. Every time I dare to speak my truth, I reprogram my own system. I create space, release tension, and give myself permission to be heard. And in that lies the most brutal and also the most healing power of the spoken word. It makes visible what long remained unseen, forces you to take a stand, shifts stuck dynamics, and changes the course, whether towards something beautiful or something challenging. Today I know, silence doesn't protect me, it imprisons me, and every time I choose to use my voice, I reclaim a piece of what I lost through years of silent endurance, my clarity, my self-respect, and my right to my own truth. Chapter 16. The danger of trying to heal too quickly. Sometimes you long more than anything for that inner pain to finally stop, for the doubts to quiet, the fears to vanish, the old wounds to close. You've had enough of sleepless nights, unexpected tears, and thought spirals that keep dragging you back to the same place. And in that longing, a trap forms that more people fall into than they admit. The desire for rapid healing, the shortcut, the miracle fix that repairs everything in weeks, days, or overnight. I remember exactly the time when I was stuck in that mode. I devoured book after book, binged podcasts, and compiled endless to-do lists for my personal growth. I was convinced, if I just did enough, understood enough, worked on myself enough, healing would happen. And it had to happen. And it had to be now. What I didn't grasp then was that this impatience was part of the problem. It wasn't courage or determination. It was another form of escape. Escape from truly enduring, from really feeling, from going through the painful phases that are simply part of the process. I wanted to skip all the discomfort, the painless insight, the clarity without confusion, the solution without confrontation. And of course, that didn't work. The more I pushed, the more I tried to speed up the process, the stronger the internal resistance grew. It was as if my system sensed I wasn't truly ready to surrender to the journey, that I still clung to the idea of ridding myself of pain as efficiently as possible, instead of fully accepting it. The turning point came when I understood that healing isn't a straight line. It moves in waves, with setbacks, with days when you feel worse than before, with moments when everything seems to collapse, even though you thought you'd made progress. And that is not failure. It's evidence that real movement is happening. I remember mornings when I awoke clear-headed, sure I was finally through it, only to find myself hours later in a deeper emotional hole than ever. In the past, that would have sent me spiraling into a new crisis. I'd have asked what was wrong with me, why I was back here despite all my work. But over time I learned, this is what genuine healing looks like. Your body doesn't release everything at once, and neither does your psyche. It's a slow unwinding of years, sometimes decades, of suppressed feelings, buried memories, and learned defense mechanisms. And the more you rush, the more your system shuts down. What challenged me most was realizing that doing nothing is also part of healing. Pausing, enduring, waiting without immediately seeking the next fix can be exactly what body and soul need. I had to learn to sit with the emptiness that follows when old patterns release, even though no new ones have yet formed. Sit with the uncertainty, the silence, the question of who I am when no longer driven by old wounds. I began to celebrate small wins, not the grand breakthrough, but the moment I reacted differently than before. The moment I let a tear fall without shame. The day I stayed present to an uncomfortable feeling instead of running for the next solution. Those small victories are what truly make the difference. Not how fast you go, but how deeply you're willing to look, feel, and move through. Today I know that trying to speed up healing is often just another defense mechanism. One last bastion of the old self, determined to avoid feeling what's been suppressed for so long. That's why the most important decision isn't to move faster, but to move slower, more mindfully, more honestly. I stopped pressuring myself. I accepted that some wounds need time, that some answers don't come immediately, that not every day is a step forward. And that's okay. Because real healing isn't about finishing as quickly as possible. It's about building a new relationship with yourself, one grounded not in impatience but in respect, compassion, and the awareness that everything heals in its own time. Chapter 17. The language of your environment. People, spaces, stimuli. You often only realize how loud your surroundings are when you consciously step back. Closing the door, switching off your phone, turning off the TV. When the stream of conversation, background noise, and constant notifications suddenly stops. Only then do you feel how much everything around you impacts you daily, and how much you absorb without noticing. I long underestimated the influence of the people around me. I believed I could shield myself, protect myself, be strong enough to keep others' energy at bay. But that was an illusion. The more aware I became, the clearer I saw the traces left by certain conversations, certain places, certain moods. There were encounters that left me feeling drained, without my knowing exactly why. Rooms where my thoughts felt heavy, as if the air were denser. Sounds that made me restless, even though at first they didn't seem disruptive. And the more I tuned in, the more obvious it became. My environment speaks to me constantly, not through words, but through vibration, energy, atmosphere. I began to ask, what does my home say to me? Does it support or burden me? Is it a refuge or a source of unrest? I walked through each room, noticing the things I'd collected. Old letters that reminded me of painful times, clothes that no longer fit my life but took up space, books I'd kept out of obligation. All of these objects told stories I'd long since moved past. I also looked more closely at the people in my life, listening to how often our conversations actually fostered genuine connection versus rehashing drama, negativity, or repeated problems. I noticed how certain relationships left me more tired than before, and how rarely I felt truly inspired or uplifted afterward. These insights were uncomfortable because they meant taking responsibility not only for my own thoughts and emotions, but also for what I allowed into my life, the talks I participated in, the spaces I inhabited, the stimuli I exposed myself to. I started choosing more deliberately, not through drastic withdrawal or social isolation, but with clearer boundaries around what nourishes me and what doesn't. I distanced myself from people whose energy constantly pulled me down, out of self-preservation rather than judgment. I reorganized rooms where I'd simply functioned, turning them into places where I could really breathe. I introduced music, colors, and scents that soothed my system. I also re-examined digital stimuli, the flood of news, the constant availability, the endless feeds that often left me feeling empty rather than inspired. I set boundaries, phone-free times, social media breaks, deliberate pockets of silence to reconnect with myself. With each step, not only did my surroundings shift, my inner state transformed too. I became calmer, clearer, more authentic, no longer bracing myself against external energies that knocked me off balance. Of course, I still slip up sometimes, letting others' moods sway me before I notice. But the difference now is I catch it sooner and have tools to correct course quickly. The language of your environment is always speaking, whether you listen or not. It shapes your day, influences your thoughts, and colors your emotions. That's why you have the power and responsibility to shape it. Who you spend time with, which spaces you inhabit, which stimuli you allow in. With every conscious choice, you send yourself a message that your well-being isn't negotiable and that you're worth designing an environment that strengthens rather than depletes you. Chapter 18. The memory of your inner voice. Who are you really repeating? When you begin to listen closely to your inner voice, you quickly realize much of what you hear isn't your true self. They're phrases we heard hundreds of times long before we could question them. Words that stuck not because they were true, but because they were repeated, over and over again. I long believed my self-doubts were part of my character, that the inner critic who held me back was simply who I was. But the more I listened, the more obvious it became. That voice wasn't mine. It sounded like me, yes, but its content, its phrasing, its tone were all too familiar. And with each conscious listen, I noticed how much of what I told myself was actually adopted from others. I heard my parents' words, teachers' lectures, offhand comments from people who may not have realized the impact of their words. Things I never questioned as a child because I didn't know I could. Those sentences embedded themselves in me like a program so deep I eventually mistook them for my own thoughts. I remember one morning standing before the mirror, hearing again that one sentence, "You're just not as resilient as others." And suddenly I saw a memory. Myself at 12 hearing that remark casually dropped with no malice intended. Yet it lodged itself inside me, was replayed 1,000 times, without ever checking whether it was true. And that's where the real work begins. It's not enough to identify those voices. You must have the courage to stop them, to question them, and ideally to replace them with your own truths. This is where many people stumble. The old voices feel so familiar, so intrinsic to our identity. We think we couldn't think without them. I started pausing each time I slipped into an old thought pattern and asking, who is really speaking here? Is this my own voice? Or am I mindlessly echoing something I absorbed long ago? At first, it was hard to expose these voices. They often masquerade as common sense or a reasonable inner guide meant to protect us from disappointment or failure. But if you really listen, you realize they feed on fear, shame, and guilt. They keep you small and are far from being your friend. What helped me was writing those old sentences down, word for word, and reading them aloud. Hearing them that way revealed how alien they sounded and how little they matched who I am today, how they pinned me to an identity I'd long outgrown. I learned I have every right to craft new sentences, my own authentic words that don't tether me to old patterns but empower me. Phrases that don't sugarcoat reality but offer a growth-oriented perspective instead of self-denigration. Of course, those old voices don't vanish overnight. They resurface in moments of insecurity, stress, or when old triggers are lit. But now I recognize them more quickly. I can put them in context and decide whether to give them any space at all. I discovered that inner dialogue isn't random. It's the result of years of conditioning. That's why reshaping it takes time, but it's worth every effort. Every new sentence you consciously choose rewires your inner reality, and perhaps the most important realization of all. Just because a voice inside you is loud doesn't mean it's right. And just because you've heard it 1,000 times doesn't mean it speaks the truth. The responsibility for questioning those voices and choosing new, strengthening words lies with us, not with those who planted them in the first place. And that is the beginning of true inner freedom. Chapter 19. How to create an emotional vibration that truly fits you and stays. When you start working with your own energy, a dangerous illusion often emerges. The idea that you must feel good every day, think positive all the time, and live permanently in a high-vibe state. As if any dip in mood or return of old doubts signals weakness. But that mindset leads many into emotional burnout without realizing it, because they constantly force an artificial vibration that doesn't match what's actually inside them. I went through that phase myself. I wanted to appear strong, radiant, in total control of my inner world. In that effort, I lost myself. What looked like emotional stability from the outside was really a struggle against everything uncomfortable. I tried to outsmart myself, forcing positive thoughts while my body sent different signals. The realization struck me on a day when I felt utterly empty, even though I'd done everything right. Meditation, journaling, affirmations. Nothing had landed inside me. Because I wasn't honest with myself. I was trying to feel something that just wasn't there. Only when I stopped fighting my genuine feelings did something shift. I understood that emotional coherence doesn't mean constant happiness. It means being in tune with whatever is truly present inside, without masks, without force, without self-deception. I began each morning by asking, what am I really feeling today? Not what I should feel, but what is actually here. And whether the answer was sadness, anger, or exhaustion, I allowed myself to start the day with that energy, not to remain trapped in it, but to honor my truth. I learned that sustainability in emotional vibration comes not from what you do when you feel good, but from how you treat yourself when it gets hard, when old patterns resurface, when doubts grow loud, when your inner critic speaks up. That moment determines whether you stay in your own frequency or slip back into old reactions. I set small anchors throughout my day, conscious check-ins between meetings to ask, where am I energetically right now? Am I in myself or swept away by outside forces? I took a deep breath before reaching for my phone. I paused a moment before reacting to a trigger. Over time, my baseline vibration stabilized, not because I eliminated all negative emotions, but because I learned to work with them rather than fight them. I stopped forcing good vibes only, and instead cultivated the ability to stay present, even in difficult moments. That was when I realized, a lasting emotional vibration isn't about constant highs. It's about honesty with whatever's in you, and moving step by step toward what nurtures you, not through force or denial, but through clarity and patience. Today I know emotional coherence isn't a static achievement to hold forever. It's a daily practice, a mindset, a choice to keep looking, even when it's uncomfortable. And that's why it's so powerful, because it's real, because it endures, and because it sustains you. Chapter 20. You are the water, and you decide which memories you carry forward. Once you understand that your body is over 70% water, every emotion, thought, and unspoken feeling takes on new weight. It's not just about what you feel or think, but what of that remains stored in your system, what settles, what each cell carries day after day, year after year. For a long time, I didn't grasp how much my own choices determine which information stays inside me. I thought I was a victim of my experiences, my history, my wounds, an emotional memory I simply had to accept, like an unshakable layer. Then came a moment of silent clarity, not a dramatic epiphany, but a quiet realization. I am the water. I am the medium that carries, stores, and transmits. And if that's true, then I also have the power to decide which memories I want to nourish and which I finally allow myself to release. I began asking which phrases, emotions, beliefs had built up like heavy deposits inside me. Old stories of disappointment, loss, and pain. Moments when I diminished myself. Times I let others define me. All those things remained inside me, even long after the events themselves were over. It wasn't easy to surface them one by one. It took courage to face honestly where in my body certain memories had taken root, how tightly I clung to some feelings simply because they'd become so familiar. But in that confrontation lay the start of real change. I consciously introduced new impulses, not by fighting or suppressing the old memories, but by countering them with fresh experiences of joy, calm, and gratitude. Not as a forced program, but as genuine answers to the question, what do I want to store in me from now on? I pictured my inner water absorbing each new experience, gradually transforming as the new information seeped through the old layers. Not always visible, but always perceptible. I also realized it wasn't just about big life events, but daily choices. How I rise in the morning, how I speak to myself when things go wrong, how I treat myself in moments of uncertainty. I began shaping my days more mindfully, not to be perfect, but because every action, word, and thought leaves a trace in my system. And I wanted those traces to lead me toward inner peace, self-respect, and emotional clarity. Of course, old patterns still flare up, and I sometimes fall back into familiar reactions. But the difference now is I don't stay stuck. I recognize them sooner and choose consciously not to let them take over. Today, I know I'm not a passive storage for whatever happens to me. I'm an active creator. I decide which memories grow inside me and which I finally let go. And that's what I want to pass on to you. Begin seeing yourself as an active participant in this process. Ask yourself what you want to store in your inner water. What energy, emotion, story. You won't change everything overnight, but you can start today with a thought, a decision, a small moment when you consciously choose. From now on, I'll tell myself a different story, one that gives me strength, carries me forward, and truly belongs to me. Because you are the water, and you have the choice. Thank you for journeying with me this far. If this path has touched, moved, or challenged you, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what resonated most, which moment struck you hardest, or what you plan to change starting today. Your voice matters, and perhaps your comment will spark exactly the insight someone else needs. Until then, keep moving, inwardly and outwardly,